A third and final talk on stage 2 is going to be, and let me grab my notes so that I can do a proper introduction, is going to be by the founder and director of AltNow, and AltNow runs program for practical system innovation. I've asked our upcoming speaker what taking a stand means for her. And she said it's about being committed to the long-term picture, not being attached to the one thing you're working on right now. After this presentation, I hope that you walk away with the idea that we can remake the solutions for the challenges that are out there. It's the people who make the systems and we are the people. So yeah, I'm not going to say too much about this. I'm going to invite Jennie Winhall on the stage and listen to this last and final presentation on stage number 2. Jennie, stage is all yours. I'm really looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. So I'm sitting here in Denmark. But actually, I'm going to start with a story that begins in the US. And this is the story of Thomas Edison, who we all know. He's very famous for having invented the light bulb. In fact, Thomas was not the first person to invent the light bulb, but when he did create his version, his backer, Baron Rothschild, said to him, "This is going to be a single point solution. It's going to be like the phonograph, interesting, but not transformative. What it really needs is a system." And at that moment, Edison decided to become a system innovator. And what Edison should really be known for is electrification. Because in 1882, 4 years later, here is the Pearl Street generating plant, 257 Pearl Street, which was used to provide electricity to thousands of light bulbs that were lighting up the offices of JP Morgan. And it was, if you like, a minimum viable system. It was very unstable. There was no meter, so there was no way of charging people to use the electricity, but it worked. And then 10 years later, here we have the Chicago World Fair, entirely lit by electricity. And here you have an absolute working system. So what happened for that to become possible? Well, firstly, Edison was not the only innovator. George Westinghouse and Nicholas Tesla were at the same time creating an entirely different system based on alternating current, which was much more stable over long distances. And so as they were developing this system, JP Morgan was buying up all the patents. So you get this huge flurry of activity that then ensues with finance and investments, new combinations of technologies, new standards being set. It's deeply competitive, it's conflictual, but it's all in service of creating a new system. And of course, that system went on to open up completely different ways of life, from freeing women from the constraints of domestic labor to automating factory lines. And in fact, Edison foresaw a lot of these possibilities, but he chose not to disclose them. He didn't want to try and predict what this new system would open up. But it's really a system of a story of unfolding possibility, one that actually continues to unfold today through waves of innovation happening now, as it's widely thought that electrification is going to be critical to decarbonisation across the world. And with the growth of solar networks and solar grids in Africa and other places, it's very likely that the minimal viable systems of the future will be created in the global south and not the global north. So this isn't an old story, but it is an ongoing one. But back then, Pearl Street was a system shifting venture, and Edison was a system shifting entrepreneur. And that unfolding possibility is one of the signs of system shifting potential. So what do we know about how systems change? So systems change through shifts happening at 3 levels. There's a shift at the landscape level, a crisis like a global pandemic, for example, or a change in social values that put pressure on the mainstream systems in the middle here to change. And at the same time, we see new innovations coming up from the bottom. They might be new technologies, they might be new lifestyle habits, and they start to join together to provide an alternative. And that alternative also puts pressure on the systems in the middle as it gains traction. And so these new innovations start to form what you might call a minimal viable system. And that system holds the kernel of the new system that will eventually go on to transform the old regime. So the problem with this is that it takes a very long time. So Edison and the story of electricity was relatively fast over that 10-year period. But we're in the middle of, for example, of a shift to plant-based diets with the rise of veganism that really started 70 years ago with the first vegan society. And it's mostly emergent. So at a time when remaking the systems we live by is so critical, what is it that we can do to accelerate that process of transition? Well, one thing that we can do is to create and support more system shifting ventures. So there is always lots of innovation going on inside our current systems to improve them, make them better. And what we're interested in is those innovations that break out and form the kernel of a new system, that open up the path to system 2, if you like. And we think they share a number of characteristics. And so here we are in Russia in 1903, and Chekhov's new play, The Seagull, has been a total and utter flop everywhere it has been shown. But this time we're in the Moscow Arts Theatre, and the cast are rehearsing a new version, and it's directed by Konstantin Stanislavski. And this time is really different because it's the first time that actors have come together for any length of time to rehearse together as an ensemble. Before then, they were hired because of the character types they usually played. They came with their own costumes and their own props. So it's also the first time the audience is considered an integral part of the performance, invited into an atmosphere that's created by sound effects and scenery that are designed as part of the production. And this time, of course, it's hugely successful. But more than that, it marked a pivotal moment from which whole systems of thought about how theatre could be done were born and continue to influence the productions that we have today. So Stanislavski's production is one example of how a tangible experience can encapsulate a whole new system. A more recent example might be the first peer-to-peer ventures like Linux and Napster, which encapsulated the ideology of the open source movement and transformed entire industries, because each of these gave tangible expression to what you might call a system-changing philosophy. So whilst we often talk about scientific breakthroughs, it's actually often a breakthrough social philosophy that triggers a cascade of innovation that goes on to change systems. And that is because system shifting ventures open up a new realm of possibility that unfolds over time as others build on it. It's essentially a collaborative process. This is Jonathan Key. And Jonathan started out as a supermarket manager. And after seeing how many of his shift workers were underemployed or excluded from opportunities to earn a decent income because they couldn't fit other types of work around their main job or the caring responsibilities they had, he decided to set up a new kind of gig work platform that he called Labour Exchange. And so rather than employers posting the hours that they wanted and the pay they would offer, Jonathan's platform turns the relationship on its head. It allows workers to post the hours they are available and the pay they expect, in return for which employers get a more committed workforce. So on the surface, this looks like a straightforward commercial proposition. But in fact, it's part of a much bigger story of change, because we are in the middle of a transition between an old world of work in which our social safety net was organised around full-time employment backed by social insurance and collective bargaining, and a new world in which a much greater number of people are in independent, flexible work or moving through portfolio careers. And in this new world, security needs to be created through a new suite of solutions that form, if you like, a modern safety net. And that modern safety net needs to help people to manage income and insurance. It needs to create new forms of worker voice, and it needs to enable people to continue and to learn and progress across multiple jobs and gigs. So new ventures like Jonathan's are really critical to marking out this new field. And actually, the greater the recognition of and the investment in this new picture, the more successful businesses like Jonathan's will be. So that success of any one venture, if you like, depends on the ability of the whole field to shift to this new operating system. And Labour Exchange will be able to do much more to address the insecurity of workers if it can connect to, amplify and benefit from this suite of emerging solutions. So Jonathan was one of 12 ventures that we brought together in 2019, from insurance companies to income smoothing businesses, to increase their impact on economic security. And because they'd started to see this bigger picture, several of them decided to join up with a new type of union to provide a suite of benefits to independent care workers. So in effect, what they're doing is coming together to create that minimal viable system. And so importantly, from their point of view, it's not competitive advantage that matters, but collaborative advantage when you're shifting a system. But how is it that you actually help the existing system to make that shift? Well, this is Abby Rose on her family farm in Chile. And Abby and her team develop technology products that enable farmers to observe and understand the quality of their soil and how it's changing as they switch to regenerative farming methods. It's a very successful business, but Abby is not only running a tech company, she's also working with groups of funders to create the new types of transition finance that will help farmers to get out of the high intensity crop yield agreements that they're in. And she also runs Farmerama, which is a podcast that features the voices of farmers and growers who are rebuilding our food and ecosystems from the ground up. So she's really connecting a growing movement through that. And so in effect, Abby is investing in multiple activities that all serve to help the farming community make the transition to more regenerative forms of land use. And Abby is typical of system shifting entrepreneurs because we know that they spend about 50% of their time on helping the system around them to transform alongside delivering their core business. So that might be building complementary assets like we saw during the development of the collaborative consumption movement. We saw lots of reputation and trust scoring type innovations to support that to grow. It might be changing the public narrative at that landscape level, like we've seen many very influential documentaries that have supported the rise of veganism recently. It might even be dismantling parts of the old system that no longer serve, because all of these activities speed up the process of transition. But what about the system shifting nature of these ventures themselves? So system shifting ventures create products, business models, services, platforms that are designed to reconfigure the landscape around them, to re-engineer the way that power operates, that relationships are structured and resources flow to meet a new purpose. So these are really the materials of system change, and we call these the 4 keys to unlock system change, because what often happens is that in our current systems, power, resources and relationships are all locked together in service of a specific purpose. And to shift the system, we have to find ways of unlocking them and channeling them in new directions towards a new purpose. And that's really what Jonathan's doing with Labour Exchange when he changes the balance of power between workers and employers. It's also what the early peer-to-peer platforms like Airbnb and the peer lending bank Zopa were doing. They were creating networks of peer-to-peer relationships that opened up and distributed resources in ways that transformed whole industries. But the most fundamental shift is a shift in purpose, what the system is for. And that is what Karen McCluskey, the chief police officer in Glasgow, did to end knife crime in what was then the murder capital of Europe. So Karen inherited a policing system that was tightly organised around the purpose of catching criminals and bringing them to justice. But Karen did something very different, because she recast violence not as a crime, but as a disease. And she set about building a new kind of system that would contain the spread of that disease, so contain the spread of violence. And reframing the purpose allowed Karen to open up the boundaries of the system and therefore the types of resources available to her and her team. And that was anything from the nurses in the hospitals who now help young people to get out of gangs, to veterinary surgeries in the community who now act as early warning signals when they see pets that have been damaged through domestic violence. And the new system that Karen built went on to cut knife crime dramatically by 60% in 10 years. But changing the purpose of a system really involves digging deep to uncover the assumptions and the beliefs from which the current system has grown and build out alternatives. And that is what Diane Roussin is doing in Canada with the Winnipeg Boldness Project, where she's creating a new system for child welfare that's based on Indigenous ways of knowing. Because as Diane says, First Nations communities had economic and health systems before settlers came, built on different kinds of principles, central to which is the idea of connectedness. So you can't live a good life without being connected and related. And so what Diane is doing is to create examples of how those Indigenous knowledge systems can help mainstream social care systems change into something better. And those of you who heard Kat Drew speak yesterday will have heard about designers like Alistair Parvin, who started WikiHouse and a number of other ventures that challenge the deeply buried assumptions and regulations around land ownership that have really driven the UK's unaffordable housing system. So one final characteristic. System shifting ventures deliberately set out to do things differently, but they also have to be sustainable within the terms of the current system. And many ventures set out to change a system only to find themselves co-opted back into the very system they set out to change. And that's because in the search for scale, the fastest route to growth often comes through attaching yourself to the existing system, becoming part of it. And so many ventures scale successfully without actually shifting the system's purpose or operations. So importantly, system shifting ventures are able to face both ways. They create things that are viable in the existing system whilst opening up to the new. And that is a key design skill. So these 7 characteristics mark out system shifting ventures and how they work. And they will be critical to the kind of future systems we need. But they're not well supported by either our innovation culture or our investment systems. And these entrepreneurs tell us that their most transformative activities are consistently the least funded. And so one thing we need to do is to challenge the dominant model for innovation when it comes to venture development. So the classic accelerator model assumes that you start with many ideas and you funnel down to a small number of high growth solutions. And that doesn't work for system innovation, where the job is not to fit into the current market, but to build out a new system and therefore a new market. And so what we do is to reverse that funnel. So it's more like a loud hailer amplifying out. So we start with a story of big change, and then we open out to invite a wider group of collaborators to connect their activities to that bigger story. And there are also implications for us as designers, because much design practice in recent times has been about making things fit better. It's been about agile development to meet customer expectations, prototyping to validate assumptions. But system innovation is not about designing to fit existing mental models and lifestyles. It's about sparking new ones. And so taking a stand is really about the ways we design not for market fit, but for system change. That means designing for all of the things that make a conducive environment for change, and people like Terry Irwin and the Transitional Design School are really paving the way in that. And it also means challenging our own starting points as designers, because we automatically value newness and progress. We think of man as the central protagonist, truth as objective, and worlds as universal. And of course, some of the most exciting work now is coming from communities that do not hold those views. And opening design itself up to those different ways of knowing will be critical. So I'll leave you with one dilemma of system innovation, which is that, of course, there is not really any client. But Cheryl Dahl, who's the founder of Future Fish, says that we should see the future system as our client. And that requires hope and the imaginative capacity of many diverse communities. System shifting ventures have visions not just of better services, but of better ways of living. And they find practical ways to open up that possibility. And system shifting designers do too. So if user needs and problem solving were the design tools of the last decade, then imagination and possibility giving are the design tools of the 2020s in order to create the systems that we need now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And that last note definitely resonates with the keynote that was today about imagination and creating the dreams, creating the visions of the future. So yeah, super inspiring, very important message about creating alternative systems for innovation, for growth, and the role we as design community play here.